How many times have you given up something you wanted out of fear of what others would say? Hi, I'm Yuna, and I welcome you to Happiness of Love. Get ready for an exciting story that will leave you amazed. Enjoy the video, and may God bless you and your entire family. Have an amazing day. Kate ran her fingers over the satiny fabric, analyzing each seam as if her life depended on the perfection of that dress. The hustle and bustle around her didn't distract her. Models came in and out of dressing rooms, assistants ran around with last-minute clips, and photographers' flashbulbs exploded in all directions. It was the big annual fashion event in New York, and she knew that this show could define her future. His name was starting to gain space among the greats. Chief stylist of one of the most promising brands of the year, Kate Harper was only 28 years old, but she was already respected for her boldness and sophistication in design. Her talent had brought her here, and she wouldn't allow anything to divert her focus. Nothing. But then, the murmur around him changed tone. A presence made itself felt before she even saw it. William Hawthorne had just entered. The 35-year-old CEO of Hawthorne & Co., one of the largest fashion and accessories companies in the world, was a sight impossible to ignore. Dressed in an impeccable graphite suit, with his tie loosened enough to look casually elegant, he carried a natural magnetism that made any room spin in its orbit. It wasn't just his chiseled face or the posture of someone who commanded empires. There was something about him, an air of confidence and mystery, as if he knew exactly the impact he was making and reveled in it. Eyes turned to him, and Kate couldn't help but do the same. Their eyes met for a brief second. A spark. The moment was short, but long enough for an unexpected heat to spread throughout her body. Kate forced herself to look away, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. He walked around the room with a confidence that made it seem like everything there belonged to him. And in a way, it belonged. His company was a sponsor of the event, and he was one of the industry's most influential investors. Women watched him with discreet smiles, hoping for a glimpse of attention. Men adjusted the knots on their ties, as if their mere presence required a higher level of posture. Kate turned to continue her inspection of the dress, trying to shake off the distraction. The last adjustment to the seam, one last look at the fit, and that's it. Everything needed to be impeccable. But then, a deep, velvety voice sounded from behind her. An impressive work. She froze for a brief second before turning around. William Hawthorne stood just a few steps away, observing his creation with an analytical eye and, at the same time, full of genuine interest. Kate lifted her chin, maintaining her composure. Thanks. I hope you like it even more when you see it on the catwalk. He smiled, one corner of his lips rising subtly, as if he appreciated her confidence. I have no doubt. His eyes studied her for a moment, not in an invasive way, but like someone who knows how to recognize talent. You're Kate Harper, right? She raised an eyebrow, surprised that he knew her name. Try. The designer everyone is talking about lately. Kate felt a mixture of pride and caution. The compliment coming from him had weight, but he didn't want to get carried away. Just doing my job. William nodded, keeping his gaze fixed on her. I would say it's doing more than that. It's creating something memorable. Before she could respond, one of his aides approached, whispering something in her ear. William waved briefly and turned to her one last time. See you at the parade, Kate. And then, he walked away, leaving behind a trail of woody perfume and a strange feeling in her chest. Kate let out a breath she didn't even realize she was holding. This was definitely not an easy man to ignore. The sound of applause filled the luxurious hall as the parade reached its grand finale. Models glided down the runway, showcasing the creations that Kate and her team had worked tirelessly to produce. The energy was electrifying, a mix of anxiety and triumph coursing through her veins. This was the moment he had lived for. The culmination of months of dedication. But even there, surrounded by the glow of her success, William Hawthorne's presence was a constant shadow in her mind. Kate tried to ignore him, to stay focused on the event, but every time her eyes wandered over the crowd of important guests, there he was. The CEO watched intently, his expression serious and analytical, his eyes fixed on the catwalk as if evaluating every detail. There was no way of knowing what was going on behind that discerning gaze, but a small, inconvenient part of her wanted to find out. As soon as the lights went out and the parade came to an end, Kate took a deep breath. It had been a success. She could feel it. The buzz from journalists, businesspeople and influencers confirmed this. But there was no time for celebrations, interviews, greetings and business contacts awaited her. She was in the middle of a conversation with a fashion editor when a low, firm voice made her skin crawl. You exceeded expectations. She turned slowly, knowing exactly who she would find there. William was even closer than before, his presence dominating the surrounding space as if it were natural. Up close, it was even more imposing. Tall, with broad shoulders, his face sculpted to perfection. His eyes carried something beyond simple admiration for the parade. There was a spark of interest, a quiet challenge. Kate didn't want to appear impressed. He straightened his shoulders, maintaining a professional tone. "I'm glad you liked it." He tilted his head slightly, watching her with that discerning gaze that seemed to read beyond her words. "I liked it more than I expected. The talent you demonstrated today gave me an idea." She raised an eyebrow, curious despite herself. "What kind of idea?" William gave a half smile, but didn't respond immediately. "Can we talk in a more private place?" Kate hesitated. "I was used to professional meetings, discussing business with investors and business people." But something about the way he said it, the intensity in his gaze, made your heart race. Still, his rationality won out. "If it's about work, we can talk right here." William seemed amused by her resistance. "Do you always maintain this defensive posture?" She crossed her arms, holding his gaze. "Only when necessary." His smile deepened, as if he had just found something even more interesting in her. "Fair. So let's get straight to the point. I want you to work with me." Kate's heart skipped a beat. "Like this?" "I want you to create an exclusive line for Hawthorne & Co. Something innovative, sophisticated, with your signature." The proposal took her by surprise. Hawthorne & Co. was one of the largest fashion empires. Any designer in the world would kill for a chance like that. Kate opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again. His mind raced in conflicting directions. This could propel your career to a level you hadn't even dared to dream of so soon. But working with William meant stepping into the eye of the storm. He was a public figure, constantly surrounded by speculation, and any involvement with him, even strictly professional, would put his name in the spotlight in a way that could be damaging. William noticed her hesitation. "I know it's a big decision. Think about it. But know that, if you accept, you will have complete creative freedom. I trust your talent." Kate studied him for a moment. It was difficult to decipher the intentions of a man like him. Everything about him seemed calculated, but at the same time, she felt there was something genuine in his words. "That doesn't seem like something you do often," she said, testing him. He smiled, as if he had been waiting for that remark. "I don't." A charged silence settled between the two. Finally, Kate took a deep breath. "I need some time to think." William nodded, as if he already knew that would be the answer. "Of course. But don't take too long." And with that, he gave her one last look before walking away, leaving Kate alone with her whirlwind of thoughts. As the surrounding hall continued in its turmoil, all she could feel was the quickening pulse within her chest. Working with William Hawthorne was a life-changing opportunity. But at the same time, he was a risk that could change everything in ways she wasn't sure she wanted to face. Kate stared at the contract on the table with a mix of apprehension and excitement. His fingers lightly slid over the paper, feeling the texture of the document that carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Signing that meant crossing a definitive line, abandoning any possibility of remaining in the shadows and finally exposing herself to the world under the most intense spotlight of the fashion industry. His mind was spinning in a whirlwind of thoughts, divided between the desire to grow and the fear of what would come with that ascension. The proposal was grandiose, a gigantic leap for his career, and anyone in his position would have accepted without hesitation. But it wasn't just about work, it was about him. About William Hawthorne and the inevitable storm his presence would bring into his life. She tried to convince herself that she was being irrational, that this was just a business contract, but something inside her insisted that this was different. William was no ordinary businessman. He exuded a dangerous magnetism, a silent power of attraction that made anyone lose track of their own stability. And now, by accepting that contract, she was placing herself directly at the epicenter of the hurricane. Still, she signed. The news spread quickly. Within a few days, Kate Harper's name was already circulating among the biggest fashion portals, cited as Hawthorne & Co.'s new bet. Eyes turned to her like never before, reporters began to speculate about her partnership with William and, inevitably, rumors arose. Some headlines hinted at a possible romantic involvement between the two, others pointed out that Kate would be just one of the many designers that William had supported before discarding. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was expected, that it was part of the game. But the truth was that the mere mention of her name next to his made her feel an uneasiness she didn't want to admit. His first official meeting with William as part of the project took place at the headquarters of Hawthorne & Co., an elegant skyscraper rising in the heart of Manhattan. When she entered the imposing lobby, she felt the curious looks of the employees who clearly already knew who she was. He continued to the indicated floor, keeping his chin up and his posture firm, refusing to show any insecurity. As soon as the elevator doors opened, she was greeted by an attendant who led her to a large meeting room surrounded by glass windows that revealed the city below. William was standing next to the table, examining some papers with the calm attention of someone always in control. When she entered, he looked up and smiled, a smile that not only looked professional but carried something more, something subtle that made her stomach turn. He said he was happy that she had accepted the proposal, that he was sure they would do something extraordinary together. Kate nodded, keeping her tone matter of fact, saying she wanted to better understand his expectations for the collection. He approached, taking one of the sketches she had previously sent and analyzing it with attentive eyes. He said he loved the boldness of the lines, that there was something sophisticated and, at the same time, unexpected about her creations. Kate felt a quiet pride bloom inside her, but she forced herself to remain distant. He responded that he wanted to create something that was a balance between art and functionality, that represented the essence of the brand without losing his identity as a designer. William smiled sideways, saying that it was exactly this confidence that made him believe in her. The meeting continued with discussions about materials, deadlines, and launch strategies. Kate remained focused, avoiding any distractions, but she couldn't ignore the way William was looking at her. It wasn't invasive, but it was constant. There was an interest there that went beyond professionalism, something that made her skin tingle whenever he leaned slightly toward her to discuss a detail in the drawings or when his fingers accidentally touched hers as they turned a page. When the meeting came to an end, he said he wanted to show her something before she left. He led her down a wide corridor to a private studio within the company, a space reserved for experimentation and the development of special pieces. Kate was impressed by the structure, the perfect lighting, the strategically placed mannequins and the rolls of luxurious fabrics that seemed to be crying out to be transformed into something grand. William leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms as he watched her explore the space. He said he wanted this to be the place where she felt free to create, without limits, without impositions. Kate felt a tightness in her chest when she realized how real this opportunity was. It wasn't just a project, but an invitation to dream big, to leave your mark on something that could redefine your career. She turned to face him, finding those intense eyes fixed on hers. He asked if she was satisfied, if that space met her expectations. Kate nodded, saying it was perfect. But before he could look away, he felt the tension deepen. There was something in the air, an invisible thread pulling them both closer. William held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for some silent permission she refused to give. She cleared her throat, breaking the moment, saying that she needed to go, that they had a lot of work ahead of them. William smiled slightly, but didn't try to stop her. He just said he was eager to see what she would create there. As Kate left the building, she felt the cold city air against her face and realized she had been holding her breath for too long. His heart was still beating fast, and, for the first time, he allowed himself to admit that keeping that relationship strictly professional would be a much bigger challenge than he imagined. Kate ran her hands over the fabrics, feeling the fine texture slide beneath her fingers as her gaze swept over the color swatches laid out on the table. The studio was silent, except for the faint hum of machines in the background and the sound of the city filtered through the large glass windows that surrounded the space. Each morning, she arrived before everyone else, taking advantage of those moments of solitude to organize her thoughts before the chaos of creation took over the day. But on this particular morning, his mind was restless for a reason that had nothing to do with sketches or material choices. Ever since he started working at Hawthorne & Co., he felt like he was treading dangerous territory. The opportunity was greater than anything she had ever imagined, but with it came the constant presence of William Hawthorne, a silent force that seemed to envelop her with every encounter. He didn't do anything overtly inappropriate, he didn't cross obvious boundaries, but he was always there, watching her with that look that seemed to decipher her thoughts before she even organized them. At first, Kate tried to ignore it. He convinced himself it was just the initial fascination of being alongside someone so influential. After all, William was one of the most sought-after men in the country. Magazines printed his face on luxurious covers, tabloids speculated about his relationships, and the fashion market revered him as a visionary. But the truth was, when they were together, he didn't seem like that at all. There was something about him that went beyond the image of an impeccable CEO. Something genuine. And that scared her more than any rumor or headline. The studio slowly filled up, and she forced herself to focus on her work. Models arrived for fittings, seamstresses made adjustments, and Kate immersed herself in what she did best. The days were long, filled with decisions and details that demanded your full attention. But even there, between lines, lace and fabric cuts, William found ways to invade his space. He would show up at the studio without warning, as if it were natural. She said she wanted to see the collection progress, but Kate knew it was more than that. He asked questions that few business people would ask. I wanted to understand her creative process, what inspired her, what her references were. Once, as she adjusted a dress on a mannequin, he approached, his eyes attentive to the way her hands worked. He said he liked the way she transformed ideas into something tangible, that there was a passion in the way she created. Kate tried to ignore the effect of his words, staying focused on the piece in front of her, but she felt heat creep up her neck. The tension between them was a silent constant. Sometimes it was almost imperceptible, like when he stood too close while observing a drawing she was showing, her woodsy scent filling the space between them. Other times, it was so obvious that it was suffocating, like the night of the company event, when everything seemed to get out of control. It was an exclusive party to celebrate Hawthorne & Co.'s new projects, an event packed with influential figures from fashion and business. Kate didn't want to go. He knew that his presence would draw attention and that, inevitably, his name would be linked to Williams again. But refusing was not an option. She wore a long black silk dress, simple and elegant, tied her hair in an impeccable bun and headed to the venue, keeping in mind that it would just be a professional evening. But as soon as he entered the luxurious hall, he realized that he had underestimated the situation. Looks fell on her almost immediately, some expressions curious, others appraising. Photographers recorded everything, and journalists whispered as she passed by. Kate pretended not to notice, walking steadily to the bar, where she ordered a glass of champagne. It was then that he felt it. Even without looking, I knew William was there. It was as if the entire room had changed with his presence. When she finally turned around, she found him standing a few feet away, surrounded by investors and executives, but his eyes were fixed on her. His gaze swept over her silhouette, a silent, intense assessment. Kate felt a shiver run down her spine. He approached slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. He stood next to her at the bar, his presence warm and commanding. Said she looked stunning that night. Kate responded by saying she was just there to represent the collection, trying to sound nonchalant, but her heart was racing. William smiled sideways, as if he saw beyond her facade, as if he knew she was running away from something much bigger. The night continued with interactions that tested their limits. He introduced her to investors with pride, as if she were an essential part of the company, but he always kept his hand on her back as he did so, a light touch that made her skin tingle. When they danced, amid the pressure of the surrounding gaze, Kate felt the warmth of his hand on her waist, the closeness of their bodies, the slow rhythm of the music that made everything seem more intimate than it should. For a moment, a single, dangerous moment, she felt like giving in. To forget the consequences, to let herself be carried away by the magnetism that drew her to him from the first look. But then, a reporter approached, her eyes shining with curiosity as she asked if this was the beginning of something more than professional between the two. Kate froze. William kept his expression calm, but his eyes met hers, a gleam of something indefinable passing across his features. He said Kate was a brilliant partner and that the collection would be memorable. But there was something in his tone, a tiny hesitation, that let her know he wanted to say more. It was enough for Kate to walk away. He murmured that he needed some air and went out onto the terrace, taking a deep breath of the cold night air. His heart was still racing, his mind a jumble of conflicting feelings. William was a risk, and everything that night only reinforced what she already knew. If he continued to get closer, there would be no turning back. But then, she felt the terrace door open behind her. And she knew, before she even turned around, that he had followed her. The cold night wind cut through Kate's exposed skin as she stepped out onto the terrace, but the shiver that ran through her body had nothing to do with the weather. His heart was still racing, each beat echoing the tension of what had just happened inside that luxurious hall. He leaned against the stone parapet, closed his eyes for a brief moment and tried to find balance in the freezing air, in the vastness of the illuminated city in front of him. But none of that was enough. Nothing erased the feeling of William's hand on her waist as they danced, the way his eyes devoured her without needing a single word. But she needed to remember what was at stake. Ever since the contract was signed, Kate had been convinced that she could keep everything under control. That her talent and her work would be the center of attention, not the relationship the media seemed determined to create between her and William. But it was impossible to deny what happened every time they were in the same room. The heat in his eyes, the tension in the little touches, the way he made her feel when he talked about her talent, as if it were something precious. And now, after that night, after what almost happened between them, she knew she was in dangerous territory. It was then that she heard the sound of the door opening behind her. She didn't even need to turn around to know who it was. William approached slowly, hands in the pockets of his perfectly tailored suit, his penetrating gaze capturing every detail of her expression. The distance between the two was small, but it carried the full weight of uncertainty. He said he was wondering how long it would be before she ran away. Kate forced a dry laugh, saying she needed air, but she knew he wouldn't believe it. William always saw beyond his excuses. He said that was a problem, that she was always running when things got intense. She felt her chest tighten. I didn't want to have this conversation. Not there, not now, not with the entire city waiting to see if she would give in to the most sought-after man in the fashion industry. She crossed her arms, keeping her eyes on the city in front of her, saying that they were just dancing, that there was nothing wrong with it. William laughed lightly, a hoarse, skeptical sound. He said he didn't believe it for a second. Kate felt her body tense, but she forced herself to remain impassive. He said he was exaggerating, that this was all press speculation and that, for the good of the project, it was better that they didn't give any reason for more gossip. But William didn't seem willing to accept that answer. He moved closer, enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence, the woodsy scent of his perfume mixed with the cold air. She said the problem was that she worried too much about what other people thought, that she got caught up in the idea of proving that her talent was enough without needing anyone else. Kate felt a lump form in her throat. He wasn't wrong. She had spent years building her career based on the idea that she needed to support herself, that any association with someone powerful could erase her identity, make people not see her work as something independent. Being linked to William was the kind of thing that could put everything at risk, turn her trajectory in another direction, one she might never be able to escape. She turned to face him, her eyes carrying a silent challenge. She said she didn't want to be known as the designer who was lucky to be associated with William Hawthorne. William held her gaze for a long moment, and for the first time, there was something different in his expression. This time he didn't smile. He said that if she thought he offered her the partnership for any reason other than her talent, then she didn't know him as well as she thought she did. Kate felt a weight in those words, something real, something that made her feel guilty for the first time. She knew that William was not a man who offered opportunities out of romantic interest. I knew he wasn't the type to surround himself with people out of convenience. But that didn't change the fact that, for the world, her presence at his side was enough to make them question everything she had achieved. She looked away, saying she needed to think. William sighed, running a hand through his hair as if he were dealing with something much more complex than he imagined. She said she would wait, but at some point she would have to stop running away and decide what she really wanted. She stood there, watching him walk away, his every step echoing against the stone floor, until he disappeared back into the room. Kate knew he was right. I knew I needed to make a decision. But I feared that, whatever the choice, there would be no way out of this story unscathed. Kate dove into her work as if her sanity depended on it. She spent hours in the studio, surrounded by fabrics, patterns, and hastily scribbled notes, refusing to give space to any thought other than the collection she was creating. Every detail demanded her absolute attention, and she clung to it like an anchor, as if she could protect herself from the hurricane that threatened to drag her to a dangerous place. He had been avoiding William for days. Since the night of the event, he had maintained a rigid barrier between the two, limiting their interactions to what was necessary and refusing any attempt by him to take the conversation to a more personal tone. He seemed to have gotten the message. He didn't look for her outside of work hours, he didn't show up unexpectedly at the studio like he usually did. But that didn't mean he was distant. Quite the opposite. Kate felt his presence even when he wasn't there. She noticed it in the looks on the eyes of the Hawthorne & Co. employees, in the way their conversations fell silent as soon as she passed. She noticed in the journalists that they now seemed to have an even greater interest in her work, as if they were waiting for her to make a mistake. But most of all, I noticed him. In the few moments when they had to share a room, William no longer tried to hide it. His eyes always met hers, intense, attentive, as if he expected her to give in at any moment. As if she knew that, no matter how hard she tried to resist, something inside her already belonged to him. And that terrified her. But she was determined. He needed to get away. He needed to focus on the only thing that really mattered, his career. So when he saw the headlines the next morning, he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Her name was plastered across the covers of major gossip sites, mixed with William's in a swirl of speculation and innuendo. They said she was taking advantage of his influence to boost her brand, that her meteoric rise was nothing more than a whim of the powerful CEO of Hawthorne & Co. Some articles insinuated that she was part of the long list of women who had orbited around him before being discarded. Others suggested that William was more involved than he wanted to admit, that for the first time he seemed genuinely interested in someone. But the worst part came with the photos. Images of her and William at the event, the dancing, the looks, the subtle touches that she swore were imperceptible to others. And, as if that weren't enough, a photo of the terrace. William leaned towards her, their faces close, the tension evident. It was confirmation of everything she tried to avoid. The repercussion was instantaneous. Her phone didn't stop ringing, journalists wanting statements, friends asking if it was true, industry contacts warning about the risks of being involved in such a scandal at the height of her career. When she arrived at the studio, she noticed that even her team was wary, as if they were waiting for her to say something about what was going on. But Kate didn't say anything. He closed himself off even more, refusing to feed that ridiculous narrative. If she acted like nothing was happening, maybe it would disappear as quickly as it came. It was a mistake to think that William would accept this approach. That afternoon, he entered the studio without warning, ignoring the stares of employees who quickly made up excuses to leave. Kate turned around slowly, finding him standing in front of her with a rigid posture, his eyes carrying a contained fury. He said he needed to talk to her. Kate crossed her arms, keeping her expression impassive, saying that if it was about the rumors, there was nothing to be said. But William did not accept this answer. She said it was serious, that she couldn't just ignore it and hope it would go away. Kate felt anger rising inside her. He asked what exactly he wanted her to do. Confirm something that didn't exist? Give the tabloids what they wanted? Or, perhaps, further reinforce the idea that she was nothing more than a lucky designer who was only there because he allowed her to? William stepped forward, his eyes burning with something deeper than anger. He said he wouldn't allow anyone to talk about her that way. Kate let out an incredulous laugh. He asked if he really thought he could control what was said about them. That if he insisted on protecting her, it would only make everything worse. William was silent for a moment, but there was something dangerous in the way he watched her, as if he were deciding how far he could go. Then his voice came low, firm, carrying something that made her stomach turn. He said it wasn't just about her image. Kate held her breath. For a moment the studio felt too small, the air too heavy. She knew what he meant. I knew that if I took a step forward in that conversation, there would be no turning back. But she couldn't. She turned around, picking up a random clipboard just to have something in her hands, saying she was busy and needed to keep working. William stood there for a few seconds, as if waiting for her to back down. But when he realized that she wouldn't, he let out a long sigh, a mix of frustration and something deeper. He said if that was how she wanted to handle it, he would respect it. But she needed to understand that running away didn't make the problems go away. Then he left, leaving behind the woodsy scent of her perfume and the weight of all the words she refused to say. Kate leaned against the table, her fingers gripping the wooden edge as her breathing returned to normal. She wanted to believe she had done the right thing. But then, why did I feel like I was missing something I should never have let slip? Kate stared at her reflection in the studio's large window, watching the silhouette distorted by the city lights in the background. The cold glass reflected a version of herself that seemed strange, distant. Her expression was one of contained exhaustion, her shoulders slightly tense, her eyes carrying a weight that she pretended not to feel. Ever since the scandal with William, she had tried to ignore what it was doing to her. She tried to convince herself that she was right to walk away, that all that mattered was her career, her independence, her fight to be recognized on her own merit. But over the past few days, a nagging doubt has begun to creep into his chest. After all, at what cost? The buzz of the team in the background seemed distant, voices mixing as seamstresses adjusted patterns, assistants ran around with phones in hand and models waited for costume fittings. The environment that always made her feel alive now seemed like a distant noise, an echo of something that was beginning to escape her hands. Kate knew she was still physically there, still creating, still signing every detail of the collection. But something inside her was erased. And she didn't know if she had the strength to stop it. What tormented her most was the realization that, in her desperate attempt to protect herself, to remain in control, she had begun to lose her own essence. Creating fashion had always been his passion, his identity. But lately, I felt like I was just fulfilling a role. That, by denying everything she felt for William, by refusing any involvement that could tarnish her reputation, she had stopped seeing the reason why she started it all. And then, he appeared. William entered the studio without warning, his posture firm and determined, his gaze filled with something that Kate couldn't immediately decipher. All eyes turned to him, but no one dared to interrupt. The surrounding people began to leave discreetly, as if they felt something was about to happen. Kate kept her gaze fixed on the fabric she held in her hands, feigning a control she was far from feeling. He said he needed to talk to her. Kate let out a low sigh, without looking at him, saying that they were in a work environment and that if he wanted to discuss anything about the collection, it should be brief. William took a step forward. He said he wasn't there to talk about work. Kate finally looked up. His heart hammered against his chest, but his expression remained impassive. She asked him why he still insisted on it, why he didn't accept that it was better to keep things professional. William ran his hand through his hair, frustrated, but his voice was controlled, although full of emotion. He said he didn't accept it because he knew she was unhappy. Kate felt a lump tighten in her throat. She laughed humorlessly, looking away, saying he was mistaken, that everything he did was to protect his career, his reputation, his independence. William shook his head, eyes burning into hers. He said she could lie to herself all she wanted, but not to him. He said he saw in her eyes that something was wrong, that she wasn't the same since she decided to walk away, that she was no longer the brilliant and passionate woman he admired. Kate felt a shiver run down her spine. He said he didn't know anything, that he didn't understand what it was like to be in his position, what it was like to fight to be taken seriously in an industry dominated by powerful egos. William took a step forward, his voice lower, more intense. He said he knew better than anyone what it was like to struggle against expectations, that he had spent his entire life proving that he wasn't just another spoiled heir, that his every achievement was questioned, that his name always came before his work, and that he understood, too soon, that he could never separate himself from the image the world created for him. Kate opened her mouth to respond, but found no words. William sighed, the anger in his eyes turning into something deeper, more vulnerable. He said that was exactly why he admired her so much. Because she was different. Because she didn't need anyone's name to be great. But, as he fought his shadow, it had begun to fade. Kate felt something inside her crack. And then, William did something she didn't expect. He held out an envelope to her. Kate hesitated before taking it, her fingers shaking slightly as she opened the paper. His eyes ran over the words, and his heart stopped. It was a termination contract. William was ending their partnership. She blinked a few times, confused, her gaze slowly rising to meet his. He said that if being by his side stopped her from shining, then he would get out of the way. Kate felt breathless. He couldn't say how long he stayed there, just looking at him, trying to process what that meant. William wasn't giving up. He was proving that no matter what happened, he would never try to take her. I would never try to define who she should be. And at that moment, Kate realized that she had perhaps made the biggest mistake of her life by walking away. But was there still time to go back? Kate held the termination contract between her fingers, but the rough feeling of the paper against her skin felt distant, unreal, as if this moment wasn't actually happening. The words danced before his eyes, but his mind refused to absorb them. His chest rose and fell in a ragged rhythm, his lungs seeming unable to pull in enough air. She tried to process what that meant, but all she could hear was William's voice echoing in her mind. If being by his side stopped her from shining, then he would get out of the way. This should be exactly what she wanted. For weeks she had fought to create a separation between them, to remain independent, to prove to herself and to the world that her career did not need to be defined by her involvement with William Hawthorne. But now that he was giving her just that, a path without his shadow, without his name next to hers, all Kate felt was a suffocating emptiness. She slowly looked up and met his gaze, and that was when she realized. William wasn't mad. He wasn't hurt. There was no resentment in his expression. He had simply accepted it. And that hurt more than any scream or accusation. She tried to speak, but her throat felt closed, the words refusing to take form. He waited for a few seconds, as if giving him the chance to say something, anything, but when the silence stretched, William just nodded one last time and turned to leave. Kate watched as he walked to the studio door, his every step echoing like a final warning, a silent goodbye. And it was at that moment that panic took over her. No. Every cell in her body screamed in protest, and before she knew what she was doing, Kate dropped the contract on the table and charged toward him. William had already opened the door when he felt his hand grab the sleeve of his jacket, forcing him to stop. He turned around slowly, eyes slightly wide with surprise. Kate didn't know what to say. Her heart was beating so hard that it felt like it was about to explode inside her chest, her breathing was shallow, her eyes were burning with an emotion that she had refused to name for too long. She said he couldn't just decide for her. William frowned slightly, the confusion in his gaze reflecting the chaos within her. He asked what that meant. Kate opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Because the truth was, until that moment, she still didn't know. But then, on a desperate impulse, he did the only thing that really made sense. She approached and kissed him. It was a shock for both of them. Kate felt William's body tense for a second, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. But then, as if something finally broke inside him, his hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and the kiss became something completely different. It wasn't smooth. He wasn't hesitant. It was a confrontation. A battle of wills, a belated surrender to something that existed long before they accepted it. Kate felt his fingers tighten around her waist, as if he wanted to hold her tight enough to never let her go again. His mouth moved against hers with an urgency that made her entire body shudder. And in that moment, everything she had been trying to suppress, all the fears, all the doubts, all the excuses she had created to keep her distance, simply fell apart. She wanted him. I always wanted to. And it no longer mattered what the world said, it no longer mattered the shadow of his career or the speculative looks of the press. She wasn't fading away at William's side. She was just afraid of shining too close to him. When the kiss ended, they were both panting. The silence that followed was dense, full of meanings that still needed to be said in words. William looked at her, his eyes dark and intense, as if trying to understand what that really meant. Kate cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing against his skin. She said she didn't want to run away anymore. William closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was something different there. A mix of relief and need, a silent understanding of what it represented. He smiled slightly, almost in disbelief, as if he was still processing the idea that she had finally chosen him. And then, without hesitation, he kissed her again. This time, there was no rush. There was just the certainty that, after so long of being apart, they were finally exactly where they were supposed to be. The air was still permeated with the electricity of that kiss when Kate pulled away a little, her eyes fixed on William's, her heart hammering in her chest in a chaotic rhythm. She felt his fingers still firm against her waist, his warm breath mixing with hers, creating a bubble where nothing beyond that moment seemed to matter. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to simply feel. There was no more room for denial, for weak excuses, or for the need to prove oneself to the world. It no longer mattered what others thought, what the media would say, or whether his career would be put at risk. The only thing that mattered was that, in that instant, she knew, with overwhelming clarity, that she didn't want to spend another day pretending she could live without him. William remained silent for a long moment, as if he was absorbing the silent confession in her eyes, as if he was still trying to believe that she had truly chosen to stay. But then, something in his expression changed. Relief turned to determination, and when he leaned slightly closer, his voice came low, steady, carrying something that made her stomach turn. He said that now that she finally stopped running away, he wasn't going anywhere. Kate felt a chill run through her skin when she heard those words, because there was something in the way he said it, in the intensity of that look, that made it clear that he was serious. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the warmth of his presence, allowing the moment to wash over her before reality crept back into her thoughts. When he opened his eyes again, his chest was lighter, but his mind was more alert. Because she knew the world wouldn't let them just enjoy it without consequences. I knew that the second they left that room, they would have to face everything that came with that choice. And even though he had finally allowed himself to give in to what he felt, that didn't mean that the challenges had disappeared. She sighed, running her fingers through her hair as she walked away a little, trying to organize her thoughts. He said that didn't change the fact that people would still speculate about their relationship, that their credibility was still at risk, that the press wouldn't stop hounding them now that there was proof they were together. William watched her for a moment, his eyes analyzing every nuance of concern that showed on her face, before he lifted one of his hands to gently touch her chin, making her eyes meet his again. He said that she needed to stop carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, that she didn't need to face everything alone, that now they would deal with it together. Kate felt a lump tighten in her throat when she heard that, because that was exactly what she had always done, always taken on everything as a personal burden, as if accepting help was a sign of weakness. She looked away, biting her lip, processing those words, letting the idea of not having to fight alone settle inside her. But before she could respond, the insistent sound of William's cell phone filled the room, and she knew that reality had finally caught up with them. William answered, his expression serious and closed as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. Kate couldn't hear the exact words, but she managed to capture the essence. The news had already spread. The kiss, their involvement, everything was already becoming a topic outside that room. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar pressure seeping into her bones again, but then she felt William's hand slide into hers, intertwining his fingers with hers firmly, as if he wanted to make sure she knew he was there, that he wouldn't let her face this alone. When he hung up the phone, his voice came through calmly but definitively. He said he didn't care what they said, that he was tired of living trying to fit into expectations that didn't mean anything to him, that if that would put everything to the test, then so be it. Kate felt a mixture of admiration and apprehension upon hearing this. Because as much as I wanted to believe that they could just ignore the external pressure and go with their feelings, I knew that the reality wasn't that simple. She had fought her whole life to be recognized for her talent, to be taken seriously, and now she was about to see all of that questioned for something that had absolutely nothing to do with her work. But at the same time, when she looked at William, when she felt the way he held her hand, as if the very idea of letting her go was inconceivable, she knew she couldn't go back. Not this time. So, he took a deep breath, ignored the fear, ignored the uncertainties, and found his voice. He said that then they would face it together. William smiled sideways, that smile filled with something indescribable, as if he knew that this moment was a turning point, and then he gently pulled her closer, his forehead touching hers for a moment, as if he wanted to mark that moment before the world hit them for good. And when they left that room hand in hand, facing the lights and flashes that were already waiting outside, Kate knew that her life would never be the same again. The sky over New York was tinged with orange and gold as Kate leaned against the glass railing of William's apartment, looking out at the vibrant city pulsing beneath her. The horizon seemed infinite, stretching beyond what his eyes could see, and for an instant he felt as if his own life was opening up in the same way, full of possibilities that had previously seemed unattainable. Her reflection in the glass captured the silhouette of a woman who, months ago, I wouldn't have recognized. There she was, next to William Hawthorne, with whom she had fought so hard to keep her distance, only to discover that the distance was what suffocated her. The path up to that point had not been easy. The sensational headlines still circulated, the judgmental gazes still hovered, and the weight of being linked to him still tried to challenge her. But the difference now was that she didn't care. Little by little, the narrative changed. People started talking less about who she was with and more about what she did. His collection was a resounding success. Critics praised it for reinventing a classic concept with a modern and sophisticated approach, and, through it all, William never tried to rob it of its own history. He wasn't the CEO who projected it to the top, he wasn't the powerful man who made it relevant. He was just William. The man who challenged her to be better, who supported her without trying to control her, who saw something in her that perhaps she herself had been slow to see. She felt his approach before she even heard his voice. William slid his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her gently against him, and Kate relaxed instantly, closing her eyes as she felt the familiar warmth of his body. His breathing was calm against your skin, and when he spoke, his voice came low and husky, carrying an affection that made your heart squeeze in a good way. He asked what she was thinking. Kate smiled slightly, opening her eyes to look at his reflection in the glass. He said he was thinking about how, for so long, he believed that being by his side would erase his identity, but in reality, he had never felt as brilliant as he did now. William turned her to face him, his dark, intense eyes capturing every nuance of the emotion that overflowed within her. He said that was exactly how it should be. He said he never wanted to be an obstacle, that he always knew she was capable of achieving everything on her own, but that he was happy that she finally realized that she didn't have to do it without him. Kate felt a lump tighten in her throat because she knew he was serious. I knew there was never manipulation in his gestures, there was never an attempt to possess her, just a sincere desire to be by her side and see her shine. She ran her fingers down his face, lightly tracing the outline of his strong jaw, and then, finally, she said the words that had been trapped inside her for so long. Said she loved him. The world stopped. William was silent for a moment, but the way his eyes lit up said more than any words could. He smiled, that genuine, soulful smile that she had grown to love, and then he cupped her face in his hands, as if to mark that moment, as if to ensure that she would never doubt what he felt. He said he had been waiting for this for so long. He said he loved her too, from the moment he saw her for the first time and knew, without understanding exactly why, that he would never be able to forget her. Kate felt her heart race, her chest tight with happiness so pure she could barely breathe. And then, before any other words could be said, she kissed him. This time, there were no more uncertainties, no barriers, no fears. Just love. When they pulled away, William pulled her into a tight hug, and she closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel every second of that moment. The future was still uncertain, challenges would still exist, but at that moment, nothing else mattered. Because no matter what came, they would face it together. And Kate knew, with absolute and unshakable certainty, that this was just the beginning. Our story for today comes to an end, friends, but before we say goodbye, I need your help to keep this rhythm of stories alive. If this story moved, inspired, or simply entertained you, don't hesitate to give this video a like. It's as simple as a click, but it means the world to us. Do you want more stories like this one? Then subscribe to Happiness of Love and don't forget to activate the notification bell so you never miss any of our new adventures. Remember, we have a new video every 2 days. Share this video with your friends and family, who knows? You might inspire someone to make a positive change in the world. Leave us a comment letting us know which part of the story touched your heart the most. We love reading your thoughts and connecting with you. And if you're watching this on your phone, don't forget to hit the hype button to show your enthusiasm and help us reach even more people with these inspiring stories. Thank you for being part of the Happiness of Love community. Your support is like the heartbeat of this channel, vital and full of life. Oh, and before you go, check out the video popping up on the screen right now. It's another amazing story you won't want to miss. See you in 2 days with another story that will take your breath away. Until then, keep the rhythm of love and inspiration alive, one beat at a time.